Just spill your beans, Tommy.
2019 was a year chock full of film discussion. However, much of this discussion surrounded just a couple giant tentpole films, like Avengers Endgame, Star Wars, and Joker. But there were plenty of great smaller films to release this last year, including, but not limited to, Long Day's Journey into Night, Ad Astra, Parasite, Pain and Glory, Uncut Gems, Waves, and The Lighthouse. Which brings me to the topic of this video, The Lighthouse, the sophomore effort from Robert Eggers, who previously directed the incredible dark fairy tale, The Witch, or Vivitch. The Lighthouse is another highly stylized genre period piece, albeit in this film, there is no mysterious witch living in the woods, but there is a mysterious mermaid living in the sea. It's a story of a lighthouse keeper, or wiki, and his assistant. Both are named Thomas, and in the script, they were just referred to as old and young. Thomas Wake is an old salt, so he has a fitting name, and Thomas Howard is a drifter going by the name of Ephraim Winslow, a fellow lumberjack he watched die, a death that hangs over his head for the entirety of the film. Thomas and Thomas, old and young, master and student, order and chaos. With its two main characters, and the only two speaking characters in the film, Eggers presents an obvious dichotomy. It very much reminds me of the relationship between Freddie Quell and Lancaster Dodd in The Master. With this kind of juxtaposition and surrealist atmosphere, it's easy to interpret this as the people may not be who they seem. But before I get into conjecture, I want to take a look at how Eggers effectively draws the audience into the world. First off, the aesthetic. It definitely distinguishes itself from its contemporaries with its aspect ratio and choice to shoot on black and white film. There's more to this though. It's not your typical 4:3 aspect ratio, also known as 1.33:1. No, it's not as wide as that. It's 1.19:1, which is the aspect ratio of early sound films that's almost never used nowadays. And the black and white isn't just black and white. For one, it's genuine. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it was shot on Kodak XX 35mm stock, which is one of their two black and white stocks, the other being a reversal stock. Many films in modern cinema shoot on color and color grade to black and white in post, Francis Ha being a prime example of this. Also, Jaron Blaschke, the cinematographer, used a custom cyan filter to emulate orthochromatic film, a popular film stock in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The filter blocks all the red wavelengths from hitting the film so that the reds appear black. Considering most pores and skin tones are red, the orthochromatic emulation allows the audience to see just about every imperfection and pore on the actors' faces. While emulating the look of turn-of-the-century film, Blaschke shot with vintage lenses, using Baltar lenses from the 1930s as his primary set of lenses, but he also used an older lens from the early 20th century for some of the surrealist shots and an old zoom lens, although neither Blaschke nor Panavision knew when or where that lens was from. In addition to the aesthetic created by the camera, Eggers and his crew were rigorous in their attention to period detail. All of the costumes were period accurate, as is the look of the White House, which they completely constructed on Cape Forshue in Nova Scotia. They couldn't rent a Fresnel lens for the lighthouse, so they had one created in the style of the lens in a nearby lighthouse. The most notable period-accurate detail is the historically correct dialogue, much like in The Witch. There's a difference between the two films though. In The Witch, Eggers lifted whole sentences, paragraphs, and conversations from old texts. In The Lighthouse, he and his brother Max had to construct conversations in an old dialect. They used Sarah Orne Jewett's book, The Mate of the Daylight, as their primary source for constructing Thomas Wake's dialogue, as it featured interviews with old salts written in the vernacular. Robert Pattinson's dialect was based on Maine farmers of that same era. Eggers' obsessive quest for authenticity pays off. He immediately grounds the audience in a period-accurate setting with period-accurate characters, but only so he can subvert everything. He needed to cut down any and all anachronisms so that the story could work. As an audience, we need to believe that we're on that rock with the Thomases. The authenticity heightens the more dreamlike, surrealistic elements and scenes. Eggers keeps reality and dreams separate at first, but he merges them over the course of the film until there is no distinction between the two. Eggers also uses contradictions and gaslighting to make everything feel crazy. Thomas Wake changes the story of how his leg became gimpy, switching from blaming it on an injury to saying that it was caused by scurvy. Wake also asked Howard why Howard chased him with an axe, right after we saw Wake chasing Howard with the axe. And finally, Wake attacks Howard with an axe after we believed Howard killed and buried him. Now that we have a baseline for why the film works, and why it's great, we can start thinking about how we can interpret it. Something that I love about The Lighthouse is that it doesn't lend itself to just one interpretation. The first watch through, I saw it as a tale of two crazy men isolated on a rock, with the isolation driving them crazier and crazier. The ending, where Pattinson looks into the light before falling down the stairs, threw this realistic approach into question. Perhaps there was an enchantment in the light. I started pondering everything about the film that I could recollect, and I started thinking that perhaps Thomas and Thomas are the same person. Maybe Howard is real and Wake is a projection. I also drew parallels to the story of Prometheus and how he had stolen the fire, only to have his liver eaten by a bird every day. The second time I watched the film, I latched onto a line wherein Wake equates the light to salvation. My perspective shifted. I saw the lighthouse tower as a physical manifestation of the distance between heaven and hell, with Wake barring Howard from seeing the light. My mind started putting more elements together to fit this theory. For example, Wake claims that there is a dead sailor's soul in every seabird, and let me tell you, there are hundreds of seabirds on that rock. That rock surrounded by God knows how much freezing cold water, with no help arriving anytime soon. And time. The line, "How long's it been?"
5 weeks. 2 days. Where are we?
Comes to mind. Of course, the passage of time can be blurred from boredom, craziness, or alcoholism, but it would also work if you thought of the setting as purgatory. Also, it seems like Thomas Wake is there to torment him. He has him whitewash the lighthouse, but they don't finish it. He also has them inventory the silverware and scrub the floor countless times, all while barring him from looking into the light. When Thomas Howard does eventually look into the light opens itself to him, and then there's this effect that makes it look as if it's ripping his soul from his body. Maybe it's not salvation, but judgment, and Howard has subjected himself to judgment before paying the proper penance. But then my friend brought up an interesting idea, that the final shot is not the final part of the film chronologically, that perhaps birds eating at the semi-dead corpse of Thomas is his physical state for the whole film, and the film shows his soul being judged. Of course, my interpretations of the movie are not canon, and I'm sure that there are many other ways to see this film. The thing is, it works as a film that is just about crazy lighthousemen, but it leaves itself open enough to be seen from a plethora of angles. That's why, for me, it's easily one of the best films of this last year. It manages to satisfy on aesthetic, emotional, and intellectual levels. It isn't too ambiguous so that you have no idea what's going on, but it isn't too straightforward so that it's all too obvious. It rides the middle line quite adeptly. It's a movie that demands repeat viewings, inviting the viewer to understand and see more and more each time they watch, but it never completely reveals itself. Emotionally, we immediately understand it, but we watch it again and again to grasp at it intellectually, much like how myth works. Maybe in the future, it won't come to be known as a classic movie, but as an American myth.